The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone. My name is Oak Mountain, and I'm your host. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Justin McSweeny. Justin is the host of the IdeaCast interview series on YouTube and now on Spotify. He's also the creator and curator of Illumin Life Project, a free website that helps people with personal inquiry and the facilitation of transformative practices. Our conversation focuses on topics of self-conception, perception, and the profilic self. It was a sincere pleasure to converse with Justin, and I trust that you will enjoy this conversation as well. Fantastic. Well, Justin, I have long awaited this conversation. I find myself quite excited to showcase the grounds that we might explore. So thank you so much for being here.
And likewise, Oak, thank you for having me because you have an academic background in the things that we're going to be talking about. You have an education that substantiates this conversation, and I'm just kind of a guy that watches YouTube. And I have no education, so that you will have me as a conversational partner, I offer my gratitude to you for that. And I'm sure we're going to have a rich conversation, but I want to acknowledge that to you and the audience that we can have this kind of asymmetry, but nonetheless, if we have two curious minds getting together and a little bit of grasp of the semantics, that we can move forward and have a neat conversation. So thank you for that.
My absolute pleasure. So I'll ask you the question I ask every guest at the head of the show here. What's the last thing that made you smile?
That statement I made, I guess, just like that, here we are, just two folks getting together. So I'll get weird for a second, like a Duchenne smile, which was those series of photographs that you can find on Google where I think he was a sociologist or maybe an anthropologist, Duchenne, and he was getting down to an idea on what is an authentic smile versus a forced smile. And I look at those photos and I almost think he just told a dirty joke and made people laugh, but to have a heartfelt, from your kind of soul base or whatever you want to call it, smile, oh my gosh. Probably just sometime out on my job where I'm out in nature and I just see something, whether it's a flower or an animal doing something, and I just kind of really get a good, I'm glad I was here for that kind of moment, something I can't recall, I can't cite anything, but just when I'm in contact with something that just is really beautiful. So that's my Duchenne smile moment.
Excellent. And I know that you have your own show as well, the IdeaCast interview series, which for those listeners who haven't heard, absolutely go and check it out. I've been captivated by many of the interviews that Justin's put on there. Some brilliant leading edge dialogue taking place. I'd love to know a little bit more about the Illumin Life project as well, if you could tell us the inspiration that brought you to that project.
The inspiration was probably born of concern for the state of the species, and it's such a hubristic thing for me to begin with. But I would say that as a member and resident within, that I would want for my fellow species mates to live a better life and live a life in a world that we create that is more replete with that which we all would find to be not pleasing, but that would bring about a sense of both satisfaction and well-being. That we all can set that bar wherever we want, and that we just we raise to those places together, with each other and supportive and concert and in communion, all that kind of thing. And so it's a very broad statement, but it's just that I get concerned for where we are right now culturally in the psychosocial domain, that we can do better, and we can help the ones coming up, the young ones. And so that's my inspiration. That's my drive.
Sounds like a deeply compassionate motivation, if I might say so. And the concern for the state of the species is in part something that we covered in our intro conversation when we were discussing different things that we might engage on and some different topics that we might explore. And we landed on something that was actually a term that I had heard just for the first time in that conversation with you, Justin. And that was the idea of the profilic self. And I wonder if you could lay out a bit of an overview of what that means, what a prophilic self or the investigation of such is, both for myself as well as the audience, and then we can dive into the meat of the topic.
Okay, Oak. And this is to disclaim to the audience, this is new to me. It's something that I've only engaged with in the last few months, less than a year. And I, again, being the YouTube guy that I am, there's a person named Hans-Georg Moeller who has a channel called Carefree Wandering. And he's German and he's in Macau. And he teaches Eastern studies, of all things, in Macau. So Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Eastern, and Lao-Tzu and things like that. And but what he does in his spare time is he integrates ideas from the East and the teachings that he's qualified to teach with modern, you could say postmodern and post-structuralist ideas and things like that. But he's lensing it through our times, some of these ideas. And one of his theses is this idea of the prophilic self. He even wrote a book with someone who, forgive me, whose name I don't recall, and it's called You and Your Profile. And that work and Moeller himself have been informed by other folks, as all of us have been. And Niklas Lohmann is one of them, maybe Marshall McLuhan, and maybe there's a couple others whose names escape me. But anyway, the thesis is based on an idea that we have a sort of core constituency of selfness. There is a layer of ourselves that some might call the obfuscated layer, the subconscious, whatever you want to call it, that is mostly autonomic, mostly just default processorial things going on. But in there is part of our psyche or our psychological self. And then there is the persona self. And that is, that which arrives in social settings or with family members, and that which performs or acts or behaves in front of these in front of the others, the person that you're engaged with or people that you're engaged with. And in those two tiers, there is, to use a metaphor, there's circuitry going on, there's communication going on there. And Carl Rogers had an idea that there was this thing called the Rogerian filter between those two layers, between the persona and the, I like to call it the obfuscated self, but if you want to call it subconscious, that's fine. But subconscious can get hijacked a little bit in popular culture. And I like the idea of the Rogerian filter because it's sort of a gatekeeper and also a moderator or a mediator maybe that says, okay, that phrase you just uttered or that movement you just made, the gesture you just made, is that in keeping with this core constituency of yourself, your psychic profile, which may be a layered history of selves, from day one. There's a stack of yous that has been put together, and it's amalgamated and into an identity or into a selfness. And again, to the audience, I disclaim I'm trying to be very ginger with this because I'm parroting a lot of what I've heard, and so please, go deeper with this if you're interested, and don't rely on anything I'm saying necessarily. So to speak to the prolific self, then, is we go from the persona in the modern world that we engage rather with social media and all the trappings of the internet, which is an abstraction, a social abstraction. It's not necessarily that you're in a room with other physical people having conversations. You are now in Instagram, you're in TikTok, you're in Facebook, like for old people like me, and you've curated a profile of yourself. You have developed a self outside of yourself, so to speak, outside of your being, outside of the physical you. And that self actually, it doesn't seem too controversial to me, has a life of its own. It is curated by you, and it is maintained by you, and it is enhanced by you, and it lives and dies by your whims, or it suffers by your whims. But nonetheless, the theory that Moeller puts forward is that this is a very real essence of yourself. It is an abstraction of yourself, but nonetheless, it is you in connection with that persona that then again is connected back into the sort of deeper construction of who you are. So I'll stop there for a second, and I think that kind of delivers what Moeller's working with. And apologies to Moeller if I didn't do that correctly, but anyway, that's the gist. And as I said to the audience, you guys go check it out. Carefree Wandering. He explicates it very well there.
Brilliant. So to surmise, then there's two major filters that we're speaking about, or two major areas rather, that are the historic understanding, or comprise the historic understanding of self, which is the obfuscated or the subconscious. Again, that comes with a little bit of baggage, and the persona, which is the composite of behaviors that come forward inside of social dynamics, inside of social interactions. And as such, what it sounds like is that the persona, or the personic self, the personal self, I don't know what we want to call it there, is now interacting with a subset of behaviors. And I say subset because it is new, that necessarily pushes it into a realm of abstraction that, in some cases, what I want to talk about here is actually quite distortive. And this is the technological realm that you're speaking to. This is the abstraction of the internet. And what I think is important to note here is maybe the difference between what you have explained here, and whether or not Moeller actually thinks this, but the idea that this profilic self is a genuine part of you or not. This is something that I've been chewing on and contemplating on over the past couple of weeks since our first conversation. And what's dawned on me here is that this profilic self has a number of qualities that it might behoove us to enumerate, and we can talk about them and see how they engage with different aspects of identity and the relevance of identity and self-conception in our current cultural sickness. As far as I see it, the profilic self is more intelligible and at the same time less sophisticated than not only the persona self, but also what I might call character. And that is to say that when it comes down to generating something in ourselves, or this type of personal evolution or personal insight, that's not an easy task. It's not something that is particularly obvious to the sojourner on this path. And this is why we have the archetype of the fool, the one who starts the journey and goes, I got no idea, I don't know where I'm going, but one foot in front of the other, man, right? But when we have something that is so quantifiable, there's a profile picture, there's a subtext, there's a number of friends, there's the amount of posts, there's this amount of likes, how many comments, what's my engagement, follower count. These types of aspects are immediately intelligible because they are abstract metrics of a genuine, what do I want to say here? They're an abstract metric of something that might be genuinely relational. I'm not convinced that this is genuinely relational or authentically relational. The other piece that I noticed is that there is, in some sense, the idea that this profilic self has undergone a level of complexification, and it's a detrimental complexification. And what I mean by this is that when we are working in this internal autopoiesis or mythopoiesis, the self-discovery, I don't want to say self-definition, but the self-discovery through this internal process of conscious evolution, there is a degree of complexity there, but there's also a brilliant simplicity in the wisdom that's uncovered. This rises in contrast to the complexification of, let's say I have 6 different social media profiles. I've got a personal one, I've got a business one, and I'm trying to curate all of these expressions and metrics of self that are in this abstract social space. It's more complex, but not in a way that would generate more value. This is what I would argue, and I'll pass it off to you here. What do you think about that, Justin?
Well, I like the autopoietic framing because it is real time, it's generative, and I might also say that it is an experimental self, that is a self that is tested. It is a self that is put out for approval or disapproval, or not necessarily your willingness to have it tested for approval or disapproval. But nonetheless, I think that process comes online. I might also throw another funny poiesis in there, which is allopoiesis, which is to have system X generate system Y, wherein persona generates the profilic, which could both be a very similar entity or similar agency, maybe is a better way to say it, but nonetheless is differentiated again by perhaps things like a performative nature or a people-pleasing nature or nature that wants to connect, uh, even if it's insincerely or whatever, whatever the level of authenticity is there. Because that's a piece of language I left out from Mueller's thesis, is that he calls those two parts, the persona and the obfuscated self, sort of the authentic self, which is open for debate and discussion, but it's we have to anchor somewhere. So it's controversial to say that because again, what are the stacked histories and what is the persona? The persona should be in flux too. If it's doing things non-pathologically, it should be in flux. But I think, as you pointed out, the flux rate and the dynamic recursive flux rate of the prophilic self is off the charts because it is something that you can frame. In other words, like a photo, you can freeze it. It can be static. But again, depending on the social pressure that comes back on it. So in other words, you get trolled by somebody because you put a bikini picture up on, or in our case, a Speedo picture or whatever up on Instagram, and you get laughed at, then there's the chain of reaction, right? And you don't have a Rogerian filter between. This is one of my concerns, is there is no mediating filter between. I know I'm not 100% landing back on your questions, but I'm trying to maybe broaden out where I'm coming from in terms of why this is so important. That we don't have that other filter. That it's what's coming back to the persona. Uh, Maybe the Rogerian filter can pick up, but I think that's where we can find ourselves with psychic injury, is to say that I put this vulnerable aspect of myself out there, and if it's not met with the appropriate response, that there is a negative affect or a negative valent response there, or a feeling felt by the curator of the profile. Let me stop there because that wasn't exactly coming back to the question you asked. So if you want to steer me back or reel me back in, or where do you want to?
I think those are great points, and I think this draws us to what I might highlight as the core danger of engaging with this without a high degree of conscientiousness. And that is to say that what you're speaking to about the potential psychic injury that comes in engaging in this abstract social dynamic, I think rests exclusively on the conflation between the prophilic self and the authentic self. This is when you mentioned that Moeller might say that this is an aspect of our real selves. I think that it is a branch or two too far away from this core suchness that is something we might call self. And oftentimes in my coaching and my mentorship work, I describe it as a tree, this idea of self. And it's like, look, our being, what you're feeling in this moment, that is going to be the closest that you get, your experiential realness, right? The contents of that consciousness can then, if believed and attributed with truth value, become these branches off of our sense of self. And the farther they get away, one, the more areas we've created to trigger our fight or flight, because our self is now so broad and branched out into these different areas that we're going to have this trigger that we would have otherwise been reasonable, that we would have had otherwise, and would have otherwise been reasonable inside a genuine social context. And this techno space is exactly that, if we are engaging with our profiles as though they are genuine instantiations or a genuine expression of our authentic self. It's not to say that we can't be authentic on social media, that we cannot put forward a true expression of what is meaningful to us, but the profile, the metrics, these abstractions, they are not genuine. And there's one other piece that I want to add, which is the pathology that you spoke to, that there's an evolutionary aspect inherent in the persona self and the obfuscated self that is necessarily changing. It's like anicca, right? There is an impermanence to these pieces and a living evolutionary compulsion towards betterness, for lack of a better term. And as such, what I notice is a pathological temptation that arises from the potential performative invocation of this technology. That is to say, I can be what they want me to be. I can fulfill this shadow aspect or this deep need that's gone unmet through my developmental years. And when we are possessed by this shadow and acting in this pathological temptation, we're necessarily in the same space of conflating this prophilic self with the authentic self. And I think that that's a huge danger, and we see that a lot with young in the youth as well. And I mean, I've been there. Not that I posted a speedo picture, but you know,
Well, yeah, but
in other
some
ways.
instance like that, you can instantiate something in your life where you were like, "Oh gosh, I wish I hadn't have done that." Yeah, and we do that with our persona selves too, when we are engaged in the so-called real world, and we commit a faux pas or we say something that was inappropriate, and we've triggered other people and upset them. So it works equally for the persona. But like, I think I love your tree analogy, and I love the fact that there may be to go back to obfuscation, there may be a further obfuscation in the realization that the persona self and the conflated prophilic self, we may not be aware of the dividing line, that liminal space or whatever you want to call it, where the prophilic self is not the persona self and vice versa. And bringing up the youth, I would say that we could invoke Baudrillard for a moment. It was just very cliche, but I'll do it anyway. And when he talks about the simulacra, the simulation, and the hyper reality, that younger people who grew up prior or enmeshed in the silica world of social media and the constant exposure to it. Whereas I'm old, I grew up before the internet and computers and things like that, so I see the difference. So that's where I would invoke the kind of hyper reality, wherein they don't know life before that extra step has been granted to them. That the accessibility of that extra step has been granted to them. So that's a cautionary tale. And simulacra, I love the idea of the simulacra because it's a copy without an original. Which sounds paradoxical, but when you really meditate on it, one thing I do to try to explicate that is to say that four musicians get together and they call themselves the Retreads, and they're a garage band cover band of a band called the Treads back in the '70s, but there never was a band called the Treads. But they concocted 20 or 25 songs and they go play them in bars and say, we're a Treads cover band and we call ourselves the Retreads, but there never was a Tread. Yeah, so it happens that way with the identity going into social media. It's like your prophilic self is the copy, not based on an original necessarily. We could argue I could be flawed in that way, but it just speaks to the idea of how we enter into the hyper reality, which is the new reality of the simulacra self that is not necessarily. So it may be a bad attempt at synthesizing those two ideas, but I think there's some meat on there somewhere that we can say, that you are engaged in that sort of hyper reality scenario when you are this autonomous self, in a sense, out in social media land. And by autonomous, I mean you turn your phone off at some point and you go do other things. That system is still out there interacting with the world, and it is a simulacra of you because it's not based on an original. There's a pseudo basis, maybe. There are some similarities, but anyway, I know that was tangential, but I think that's a good heuristic for people to say, oh, I see that. I see what this prophilic self. I mean, it should be fairly not obvious, but easy to suss out.
What immediately arises in response to that for me, Justin, is the question of the veracity of self definition and what I might call a thought crafted self. This is the idea that I am what I say I am, and that has an ultimate truthfulness to it that is perhaps unquestioned in some spheres. And this idea of if we accept that the thought crafted self is not true or doesn't have an inherent unquestionable veracity, then this idea that the prophilic self is this simulacra, this copy without a copy, makes a lot of sense, because there is, for the majority, and again, we're speaking in generalizations because someone out there might be using these medias in a truly authentic and expressive way. Amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, we are cherry picking aspects of our thinking, aspects of our visage in the photos we choose, and who we speak to, how we comment, and all these types of things. And that cherry picking not to be diminutive, but it is necessarily so deeply biased by our self-conception. And the self-conception is an inherently limited process. And this is one of the pieces that I've been mulling about, is that if we are to save ourselves and to perhaps alleviate the suffering of the youth, implementing a new cultural wisdom around the differentiation between self-conception and identity, or authentic self and this prophilic and conceived self, is really necessary. And I think that that cultural wisdom that we are seeing in spots, but is not particularly prolific yet, would instantiate that dividing line that you were talking about between the prophilic and the persona, or even the persona and the real self, right? Whatever the real self is, and we can get into a deep meta conversation about that, and that's a whole, 3 hours later.
Yeah.
But this piece of really working to say, look, what someone says to me, what someone thinks about me, all are at a distance from this authentic living now being that is the ground of my essence, right? I think this would be an important time to introduce a concept that I have spoken to in other episodes, which is the difference between self-conception and identity, right? That's conflated in common parlance. People think that, well, I identify with this, or I identify as this, and that constitutes an identity. Wrong. That's not the case. An identity is actually a socially negotiated role that is both internal and externally validated. And what's so deleterious about the abstract nature of this social media internet space is that there is still the compulsion of our social relational nature present in that. There is the fear and weighing of other people's words that we would necessarily take on to inform our identity, but it's so many steps removed from a face-to-face, brother, sister, best friend, uncle, community member interaction. And thus, being so far removed is missing the elements of our psychophysiology that would temper the kind of criticism, the kind of pathologies that we see rampant inside of comment sections across the board. So there's a lot
Yeah.
there that we could talk to.
Yeah, and that almost speaks what you just mentioned. That almost speaks to the Rogerian filter. It's the physical cues that are being given off. So if you just drop a post off on Instagram, or again, old people like me, Facebook, and you leave, yeah, there's no context there. There's less context there, and that shows up as a problem because sometimes people put emojis out and they're like, well, what did you mean by that? And then you have to open that up. And the idea of that persona self being inviolate in the sense that it is representing the best of yourself when you are communicating through the projected self, through the prophilic self, is to me is rarefied. Like you said, there's outliers that show up in authenticity and authenticity, and for a third iteration, authenticity, and they're genuinely being that which they may be, which we cannot identify. And I love the fact that you said it, and I'll say it my way, is that it would take a second person negotiation or interaction to understand what identity might be, and you can consent to whatever's consensus might be reached there, but that it's not something you can craft or curate yourself, which would say something about you, that you need to be more open to, like you said, a necessarily reciprocal engagement to understand more about that which is your identity versus what you would surmise to be your identity. So I like that, and I think that's important. And where is that in the curated prolific self? I don't think that capacity to reason exists in that domain, in that abstracted domain. So that's something that again is a asterisk for caution. See below, footnote number 6. See below, and understand that when we, and again, I think people, and I don't want to sound ageist, but I think people under 25 are less aware of this process explicitly. they may be able to catch some of it, especially when there is negative psychosomatic affect, kind of things coming back, and they're like, well, what's going on? And then they'll say, oh, it's just my Twitter feed, or it's just my TikTok account. Maybe they can rationalize, but can they? And who's rationalizing? And what are the social currencies going back and forth? The capital that is exchanged for likes and approval and audience size and all this thing, and yeah. So, and then we have to tie in the image of the body too, right? I mean, I see on Facebook sometimes people displaying themselves in a Donian, or whatever the female equivalent of these gorgeous sculpted people, and that I kind of idealizing can lead to um, negative outcomes for people like myself who are not Adonian in any way, and I don't care. I'm good with that. But when I'm 16 and I'm confused and I'm in this modal transition of being a sort of adultish person with whatever my proclivities might be, that's another thing that stands to be compromised, I think, in this scattered world that's being created. And uh, yeah, yeah, I'll stop there.
Brilliant. And that's a great place to take a short break, and we can come back with the second half of the show. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. All right. Awesome, Justin. Well, we are in our second half here, which means we are moving into a section I call the question of the week. This is where I invite the guest to bring forward an inquiry that is meaningful to the dialogue, to them, or something that might be interesting for the audience to engage with. So, Justin, what have you got for us this week?
And having spent all of about 3 minutes in deep contemplation, I would like to, and I'm confessing to the audience that I didn't do my homework, but based on everything we had discussed in the first half of our conversation, I would like to present to the audience, as well as the two of us, a partial continuation, but also branching out and going orthogonal to where we've been. And that is to say, in our age of information, in the age of specificity and propositional, the strength of communication, the undergirding of that is propositional mostly. We don't really branch off into, again, abstract thinking. It's a lot of binary, like yes, it's either true or false, all this kind of thing. We are in the age of information, the dawn of artificial or large language models and machine learning. I'll say that, but maybe artificial general intelligence, depending on those 3 hours worth of philosophical debate. How do we steal the culture? How do we weave in to this tapestry of, again, empirical, propositional ways of knowing, a kind of wisdom that has driven culture, uh, for millennia prior to us, and that was part of the system of all the things, the advancements in math, in the maths, or in philosophy, or in development of language and culture, and even science more recently. Where in our position that we're in right now, do we cultivate wisdom, and where do we satisfy what some have called a wisdom famine, like the starvation for wisdom, or perhaps just a hunger for wisdom, whether we know we're hungry for it or not. So I'll stop there and just say, how do we cultivate wisdom in the age of information, in the age of raw intelligence, being sort of the lord of our space?
Powerful question. And something that you spoke to in our break, I think, really provides the key to answering this. And that was the adage that you put forward from another thinker, that if it relates, it creates. And when we're talking about wisdom, I think we need to talk about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? That knowledge is more of a data set, and wisdom necessarily comes with the understanding of how to apply and what it means to use, so to say, a particular set of information. And why this is relevant is that we have a lot of information, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and our individual conscious capacity to process information is overwhelmed very quickly just by turning on the news, by turning on the computer, by looking at a news feed. And so there's a necessity for developing the skill of being parsimonious, as well as, and I want to say, really emphasizing the and here, and developing a relationship with the living world, the more than human world. That is to say, that so much of our wisdom that took us from the Paleolithic to this information age was birthed from the inherent recognition, the inalienable recognition of our relational nature to all of ecology and all other life. And that the repository of wisdom is not just the terabytes of hard drives that I have on my computer desk, but the means by which we engage with one another inside of our human contexts and as humans with the more than human world. So I think that's one of the key pieces. And you asked as well, where do we cultivate this wisdom? And it's a funny turn of phrase when I think about where do we cultivate this wisdom, because I could give you a location and say, oh, well, come to the university or come to the monastery or come to the public discourse, right? But in actuality, wisdom, one of the greatest wisdoms that I've ever encountered or received from a teacher is the understanding that all information and all wisdom comes through the aperture of the present moment. And so when we are in relationship to the present, when we're in relationship to the living aspect of our being, which is our body, and the relational aspect of life, which is ourselves to the more than human world, that's the epicenter of wisdom. It's like, some people might find it funny to say, like, I've learned things from trees. I've learned things from birds. It's like, what? I've learned things from books too. God knows I've read a lot of them. But the birds have taught me simpler and more profound wisdom than I've found in any psychology or philosophy book. And I think that's because there's a spirit there, there's a life there that is different than the abstract space of the purely mental, which we might find ourselves trapped in today culturally.
And those birds are, to again retrieve something that was discussed in the first half, they are living in a very authentic, very real time frame. Their modal, their cognitive mode is that which is directly in, as you said, in relation with its environment. It is not abstracting. It is not metacognizing. It is not philosophizing. It's not doing anything other than tending to its needs. Now, that's absurd for us to think that we can reduce ourselves to those kind of primal things. But like you said, so there's the critique of anarcho primitivism. Sorry, I'm tripping over my tongue today. But people will laugh at it and scoff at it, and it is basically the critique that says, well, 12,000 years ago, just around the Younger Dryas period, we were living tribally, communally, nomadically, yada, yada, yada. Things were very organized. Things were very put together. So extracting from the best that we can derive from that, or even in Neolithic cultures that we have present in New Guinea or in the Amazon basin, that their tribal living can be exemplars to us for a means of living that is in a probably a better homeostasis, or however you want to frame that, for their niche, for what they occupy. And we can extract that out and say, okay, well, what can we retrieve and utilize and put to work for us in that regard? Just like the bird. What is the bird doing that I am connecting with and relating to right now and finding salient to me in a way that allows the imaginal space to open up in me to say, and this is very cliche in some of the old karate movies, become the heron, become the tiger. So you're embodying that, what it is likeness, not in a qualia sense, but it just in what is going on with the tribe in the Amazon basin? What are the birds doing? So yeah, that is a wisdom practice, I think, in its own right. And I like the fact that you said that wisdom is not found in an institution or a structure or a geographic location. We could think far more broadly into the abstract commons of thought and shared um, wisdom or intelligence, that we have on board already that can then be kicked around and shared, much like we're doing now, you and I. And that's the dialogos. That's generating something, a third, an other. We're generating another through the conversation. So, but I love the idea that the simplest of things can send us into a transcendent um, mode of experience.
Hmm. I think one of the pieces that arose for me when we're speaking about this um, gathering or coming to understand the wisdom that can be found in different indigenous traditions around the world and what we might be able to glean and apply speaks to the difference between, we might say, wisdom in approach versus wisdom in application.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue that the former is what is needed now, because the idea to say, I think you said anarcho primitivism, is that what it was?
Yeah, it's one of
Right.
the big words, but yeah, it's a critique
Yeah,
of
lots of
it's a
syllables.
critique of modernity. Yeah.
Sure, and I see this a lot, and I have seen this a lot, particularly in New Age movements, where it's this sort of idealizing and deification
Mm.
of times past or ways before technology, and it's like, okay, I don't want to throw out the value of what was present in more ecologically relational, wise traditions, sure, but to incentivize us to give up modernity is nothing short of insanity, I think, in my personal opinion. And this is why I think we need to talk about the idea of approach versus application. If we are to glean the wisdom in application, that is perhaps the falsehood that is flowing from this type of primacy of the ancient ways. We ought to do it the way they did it, right? Exactly the way that they did it. But when we talk about wisdom in approach, it goes, okay, when they are relating, what is it that they bring to this moment? Not necessarily the technique, right? Not necessarily any action specifically, but the mode of relating, this seat. What's different about them internally and how they approach one another and how they approach maybe conflict or the earth, resources, other living things, and then take this and go, where is it that this approach or the qualities of this approach might be most needed and best applied in this present moment? Because again, we're talking about it's here and now that the wisdom is found, and it's also here and now that the wisdom is applied and the wisdom is shared. And I think that that's a really key piece to recognize, that we are faced with an entirely novel and, in some cases, particularly confounding circumstance of this technological new age. So I think approach is a key piece to what we're speaking to.
Absolutely, and it points something out that may be implicit in everything we've talked about so far, but that again, living in modernity and living with intelligence being far taking up much more space than let's say wisdom. That the again going back to propositional thinking and that binary sort of hard stop on either end. That's the kind of thinking that the New Age movements that we're indicting here, and we're doing that gently, but that it's an either or proposition, right? It's that we cannot continue, with this calamitous, yada yada, and then we have to go back to being Quaker Shakers and primitivists. But that's a false dilemma, in my opinion. It's why can't we be Hegelian and find a through line and find a synthesis project to marry the ideas of, like you said, what has worked in the past, what can we extract, and what can we mine from that, and how do we slot that in with what we have available to us now. Nobody wants to throw away medicine and biological science and all the things that go towards our longevity, et cetera. We have to do a synthesis project there, and it takes those mediating factors, like you said, to do that. And but like I think we get modally confused that there's only it's an either or a yes no or in whatever binaries, 1 0, that is pervasive in our culture. Like we're all turning into little ones and zero processors and calculators and things, calculus machines. And some of that's necessary. It's inherent if you believe certain aspects of cognitive science, where we are Bayesian sort of updaters. We'd like to update our priors and those kind of things, but that also has to be mediated by the imaginal, by opening up the space of possibility and the space of speculation, healthy, good faith speculation, to say, well, okay, let's retrieve this from the past, and we have this data set of knowledge that we've gained from the physicists or from whatever's going on. And again, it's up to us to synthesize that and to find the best based on the criteria, like you were saying earlier with language, the criteria that best fits an effective, functional, coherent, cohesive, all these other superlatives that can further, not us, but further the psychosocial, again, commons or domain or whatever it is.
This idea of the possibility and speculation, I think, is a great stepping stone to reweave in what we spoke to in regards to self and the Profilic self, because that aspect of possibility underlies this maybe humility or this innate ignorance that we have or ought to have around who we really are. And that when we look at some of the commonalities in these more ancient ancestral wisdom traditions, the skepticism of a acutely defined self is very clear. We can see it obviously through the Eastern traditions where, if it's Atman or Anatman, true self, no self, what is the definition, the veracity of thought generally for defining things and the pitfalls therein. This is a really key piece. And I think maybe that's one of the pieces we can bring to this, like you've mentioned. And that's a very powerful piece to say that for those listening, I know we've taken a beautiful journey around the world here, from the Profilic to wisdom traditions and the relational, that when it comes to definition of self, of your life, of your relationship to work, to parent, to the more than human world, remembering that there is always an inherent possibility space. There's an untapped potentiality in what could be, and that a willingness to be informed by that, I would argue, is a willingness to be shaped by the living wisdom greater than you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that is one of the fundamental tenets that I have noticed in the very brief and albeit shallow exploration of a number of different indigenous traditions, is that recognition. It's like, we say, well, this house is mine, or I own land, right? But in many expressions that I've heard from the elders that I've worked with, people don't own land. People belong to the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's a really important distinction, right? It's not like we've gone in an interesting direction when it comes to private property, and I don't think we ought to abolish that either. And then we get into the rise of the proletariat and all these things. It's like, no, that's not where we're going.
We tried that.
But it didn't work.
Yeah, it didn't work.
Horrific failure.
But the idea good on paper. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Good on paper doesn't work practically.
No, it doesn't
Not
work.
even
If
good
it doesn't
on
work
paper,
practically,
but...
it doesn't work.
Yeah.
The idea that there is an inherent responsibility of our life, and as it relates to the Profilic self and the development of self, there was one idea that I wanted to pitch to you here, which is this perhaps perceived conflict between the jurisprudence of meaningful character development and the right of self-definition or the freedom of thought. And for those listening who might go, Oak, what the hell are you talking about? Allow me to break it down. There's an idea here that we as individuals are responsible. We have a responsibility inherently to develop ourselves into the kind of people that bring forward meaningful value into our relationships and into the world. So that's the jurisprudence of meaningful character development. And this stands in contrast to what I see culturally, which is the overemphasis on the right of self-definition. I can be whatever I say I am. It's like, well, if we overemphasize that, there's no guarantee that we have actually organized the necessary values in a proper way that you're going to produce not only a meaningful life for yourself, first of all, but also an expression of meaningful value inside of your relationships. And so this meaningful character development is, as one of my dear friends, Dolphin Casper, would say, is a means by which we orient towards the deepest well of wisdom in any given moment. And so when it comes to the profilic self, when it comes to your social media use or your self-conception, what you're telling yourself about yourself, how much you give a rat's ass about what other people are saying about you online or offline, remember, and this is very much in the line of Epictetus and the Stoic tradition, the greatest value comes from your development into a virtuous life, not the approval of others. And I think that that's maybe an anchor point I'll get off my soapbox, but that's an important piece.
Well, I think in exercising everything that you just laid out there, that the profilic self will wither and die, and that the persona will have a through line, a direct line to the interlocutors of, or your engaged audience, or however you want to, whatever they are out there in TikTok land and Instagram world and all that. And I think once again in the West, we haven't developed these muscles, metaphorically speaking, of union of opposites and holding apparent contradictions in tonos. And this is where I'll get into sort of John Vervaeke talk, where we're doing opponent processing, where we are not locked in an adversarial processing. We are locked in a way that, how do we cut the through line? How do we develop a through line between these two seemingly difficult things? As again, you just said, there is the individualist self, and then there is the self that is developed for optimal engagement and relationality, and the good, the true, and the beautiful, the affect that is that which we would, whatever the golden rule is there, that we develop to the best of our abilities, that self that is authentically showing up and expressing itself in that mode or in that capacity. And so again, how do we take the individual self and marry it to that in that tonos? And because my definition of individualism would not be what Madison Avenue has been constructing for us for 70 years, and that is to say that the individual needs to have a good emotional hygiene, a good psychic hygiene, a good physical hygiene, if you're going to be close to people. All these things that and this is what you were saying with Stoicism, it is that you should care for yourself, but not in a narcissistic way. You care in a eudaimonic way. You care in a way that prepares you to be that good person that arrives in engagement and that relates to the other and then creates with the other, as we were saying earlier. And again, I think that's where the profilic self will wither and die, to the chagrin of all the lords of Silicon Valley and the tech bros out there, that they're going to have to figure out a new way to hijack our attention. And it can all go for the good. I doubt it. There's cynicism with hope, but that we could find a way that we can, using the tools of the immediacy of social media and the distribution, the radiation of social media, to help each other in cultivating wisdom, in stealing the culture and doing it collectively in a sense, but not in a top-down collective. It's a stigmergic collective, like you have ants are stigmergic, and fish, when they do the schooling in that, that we all sort of move in this sort of psychosocial kinetic sense forward. And now I'm really getting into la la land in terms of like hoping and aspiring, but why not set the bar somewhere? And it's not utopia at all. It's just dropping down the percentage of suffering is my goal. Because like you were saying with the New Age communes or the hippie communes that we're trying to, excuse me, go back sentimentally through to find nostalgia, curate the hunger that's found in nostalgia, the sadness that's found in nostalgia, and seek the ways of the elders. That we can't go back, and we can retrieve from the past, but we can't go back. And I think that if we can um, learn the lessons of the past, like the utopia builders and the nostalgia builders. We were talking about alluding to experiments in the 20th century that didn't go very well, i.e., communism and things like that, which were all well intended, but they were disasters. But we learn lessons from that and say, well, it can't be an authoritarian structure that does this. This has to be communal. It has to be, but decentralized communal. So it's like you walk all these really fragile lines, these gossamer threads of ideas that require us again to show up without our pathologies, or at least exercise the shadow and be in good relation with the shadow. To invoke a little bit of Jung here and say, I'm aware of what I can project and what I can bring, but that I'm working on it, and that despite that, I truly wish to commune with you and engage with you in a healthy way.
Brilliant, brother. Well, for those who are inspired by the wisdom shared today and the ideas being passed forth back and forth, and for those who are also maybe hungry for the wisdom that comes forward in this emergent dialogue, where can they find your idea cast and maybe learn a bit more about the Illumin Life project?
Excuse me. Thank you for asking that. And IdeaCast can be found on YouTube and now Spotify. So if there are show notes, we'll make sure that there's a link to that. But if you just type in IdeaCast into the YouTube/Google search, it should show up. And I just recently migrated everything over to Spotify so that people can do audio, which I tend to do when I'm at work. I'll just throw a podcast on and just do my job. And I'm fortunate in that way that I can do that. And then Illumin Life is this sort of fluxing thing right now. I'm getting ready to throw out some stuff because the last time I worked on it was about 2 years ago, and I've changed since. Much like the Bayesian updating, I want to update my priors. So it'll always be a fluxing process, but ostensibly what I'm trying to do over there, and it's a website, it's free. I have a little like Patreon kind of thing. Like if you use it for a few weeks and you like it, throw me a couple of bucks because it costs money to run this thing. But I will never charge a fee for this. This is where I try to be an egalitarian human and say that I personally don't choose to commodify what is sacred. I will not put a price on that. So, but that's me. And the constituency of that website right now is focused a little bit on kind of mindfulness practices and paying attention, but asking these questions about self and identity, and how do we reel ourselves in from the abstracted self. And so it's essentially what we're doing, what we have done in our dialogue. It is it's not prescriptive, it's not dictatorial, it's more just inquiry. Because I am at heart a old school skeptic. I will always ask questions, and I'm also a skeptic, or at least I'm I guess I'm a skeptic in the sense that I can never truly know anything. I can only let ideas pass through me, and I can share them and maybe try to build them and develop them. But I will make no knowledge claim, which sounds ridiculous. But obviously, I know things. I know how to get up out of the chair and all that. But to speak philosophically, that I will never anchor myself to anything in particular as best I can. It's self-deceptive to think I can't, but as best I can. So. That's what I'm teaching over to Lumen Life, is to just how to be a freewheeling spirit. And you mentioned this too earlier about the inquiry into self and the skepticism of self, and almost in the Buddhist sense, like the no self, like oscillate between the no self and the built self that has authentically been developed since infancy. That is so real and so essential. And when we speak of mindedness and what I would call spirituality, is that mindedness can be distributed into the space of others, into the space of the world, and share your wisdom, share your growth, share all these things as best you can in a positive way that connects with others. And that to me is a deeply spiritual practice that we can do with each other. So that's what Illumin Life tries to do, but it'll always be changing. And so we'll see.
Excellent. Well, Justin, thank you so much for your contribution today. I am exactly satisfied. I knew it was going to be beautiful, and I thank you again for your willingness to bring your curiosity and your insights to such a rich conversation. And yeah, it's been awesome having you. Thank you.
Thank you for creating the space, Oak. I appreciate it. And again, I just the gratitude I feel in these kind of engagements, is very fulfilling. And in a selfish way, it is very fulfilling. So you've helped me to be selfish today, and hopefully to the audience that there was some spark of curiosity has been has been lit or ignited, or however you want to say that. And if you want, we could share with the audience that I'll have you over as a guest, and there will be. I think you and I should have multiple dialogues. I think we can cover some different terrain or go back through the terrain from new angles and facets and things like that. So here's to that. Here's to our getting together and coming over to my salon, and we'll have a dialogue over there and open up the space. So thank you. I appreciate today.
My pleasure. And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.